Hello everyone, we are going to be looking at period 2, chapter 2, Brinkley. This is 1607 to 1754, so it's basically the foundation of Jamestown and the advent of English colonization in America, and it goes all the way up to the French Indian War. In this chapter, in this lecture, we're going to be looking more at the colonization of the three colonial regions, the New England region, the middle colonies, and also the southern colonies. And then chapter 3, we're going to look at the society and how that society was broken down within those colonial parts. For this, we see that this is about 10% of the AP test will cover this two chapters and the colonization of America. The concept here in the AP guidelines are Europeans and American Indians maneuvered and fought for dominance, control, and security in North America, and distinctive colonial and native societies emerged. So this is really about England coming over to America and then starting setting up colonies. These colonies are going to be developed and rise up and very distinctly differently from each other based on the economies and the geography and the religion of each of the colonial districts. So we're going to be looking at transportation to borderlands, Brinkley chapter 2. This will be a few-part lecture with us starting with the Chesapeake Bay colonies and Jamestown, then moving into the New England colonies, and then moving into the Pennsylvania, New York, and the southern colonies, and wrapping it up with some of the actions that the British took to do some somewhat control of these colonies. I mean, again, very modest control, but some control. Okay. The very first colony in the English area of North America was Roanoke. It was a lost colony, and it actually was not successful. We talked about this in the last chapter, but again, this is 1585. It was in North Carolina, and it didn't succeed. So we don't really focus on this and the endeavors of this very much. But let's move forward to Jamestown. We see Jamestown is right on the James River, and they're going to have a colony they're going to be putting in there for profit. So the people that came over for Jamestown wanted to make a profit, sort of very similar to how the Spanish made a profit in their colonies. They had a joint stock company called the Virginia Company, and again, their main goal was to create profit for their investors. They wanted to find gold or some riches to then enact, and react it and then take it out and then quickly turn that around for profit. So that was their first big failure, is that they were going over there with the tools and the mindset for resource extraction, quick profit, not for settling, not for longevity, not even for thinking about the problems that could arise, even in the short term of food or weather or Native Americans. So when they got over there, they weren't immediately inspired to set up a permanent colony and have it thrive. They put their resources in other areas, which was bound to eventually be a failure for them. So then there's them landing on the first island. They set up a fort very early on. You can still see Jamestown. Again, it has been recreated, and you can sort of go check it out, along with Colonial Williamsburg. And this really cool place. Again, it's all remade. It's not any of the original structures, of course, but they were made of wood. Here's a couple of the visuals you could see from that. And those first couple years in Jamestown were extremely horrible. It was called the starving time. And this starving time could be looked at the first year, where in 1607, 120 Englishmen arrived, but only 38 made it past that first year. And this starving time did not just happen for 1 year. This was several seasons before really they got a foothold, and then they actually started having a more successful reproductive and productive colony where it was starting to thrive a little bit. A huge amount of disease and starvation and dysentery were really those main culprits. And they were really having a hard time. It was almost looking like maybe it would go into the same realm as Roanoke before some changes were made. And in this colony, you see the Virginia Company, some of the terms, John Smith, one of the early governors, Powhatan, the Indian chief and natives, Pocahontas was the daughter. The one I really want you to understand and get is this one right here, the House of Burgesses. This was the first representative body in America. Again, it was very limited. You had to basically pay taxes on your own land to vote in it, and you had to be white and a male. But it was in a sort of the original representative form of government that was set up that a lot of the colonies will then sort of mimic as they open up their own colonies and start their own colonies. And when we start becoming our own country, it's going to be the foundation of what we've been having for 150 years was this sort of this form of representative government that we were going to institute into our own government, our own constitutions once we had our own country. So it's very sort of paving the way into what we are eventually going to have as a country. So that's really important to note. In regards just to understand sort of the concept of why we have the government we have now. So obviously they didn't find riches and gold and treasures in Jamestown, but they did have a very ideal climate to grow. The geography and the climate of North Carolina, Virginia, or Maryland was ideal for tobacco. And John Rolfe, make sure you sort of understand the link he has to this. He actually smuggled in Spanish tobacco plants and seeds and was able to plant them, and they just flourished. And this was going to be the big profit maker for these areas. And again, it's going to be extremely valuable, extremely important for them. It's also going to have some effects too. Obviously, with more tobacco planted, you're going to need more labor. You're going to have a huge amount of labor that's needed to bring in to serve these tobacco plantations. Also, tobacco really eats away at the nutrients of the soil. So you're going to have to constantly sort of turn over the land and use more land in the west, which eventually is going to make it more and more and more encroaching on the Native American tribes that are in the west. So to get more people into the Americas, there's going to be a system called the head right system. And this system is going to be focused on basically bringing over indentured servants from England. For every indentured servant a landowner brings over, pays their passage over, they are going to get 50 to 100 acres of land that they can then put into cultivation for tobacco or other things. So it was a huge incentive for rich landowners to pay for indentured servants that could come over and work their land for them, and new land could now be available for them to plant tobacco. So it was a huge way to get more people to come to America. And it started the labor system to really be focused on indentured servants as the major labor force in the early colonial America. And these indentured servants, they were paid contract workers pretty much, where they were forced to work for a certain contractual time, usually 5 to 7 years, because of their passage being paid to America. At the conclusion of their contract, if they made it, if they survived, which many did not, it was a very dangerous position, and many indentured servants did pass away or perish prior to their contract being up. But if they didn't make it, which again, most of them did make it, it was probably in the upwards of about 70% or so made it, 25% probably passed away. And at the conclusion of this contract, they were given their freedom. They weren't given land or mules or anything, but they're given their freedom. And of course, they are going to want to then become landowners themselves. And of course, they're going to have to move to the west and basically move to the west and to try to find the fringe areas where land was available to them. And because of all this land and this land encroachment, we are going to see our first sort of in America, with the English America, the first conflicts with Native Americans. So the Powhatan and the Jamestown settlers will have their first confrontation where they're going to be mutual attacks on each other. The Powhatan and Jamestown settlers are going to both carry out a series of rebellions and attacks, both really suffering huge losses early on. The aftermath of it is going to be treaties are going to be signed that are going to push the Powhatan to the more fringe lands in the west. And they're going to be basically subdued there until later on, where there's going to be more conflict of land encroachment, basically by the late 1600s. The Chesapeake Bay colonies are part of the southern colonies, but early on we sort of say that there is slightly differences between the two. So in the southern colonies, you have the Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. And in some cases, you could include Delaware there. Some people include Delaware in the middle colonies. It's just sort of where you're thinking on where you want to go with that. The Chesapeake Bay colonies would be Virginia, Maryland. They really, you see, focus on tobacco. They are the main tobacco-producing colonies. North Carolina, to some extent, but then you get in the southern colonies, see rice and indigo really make up the profit of the economy of the southern colonies. Maryland was started as a proprietary colony, and because of that, they were given the absolute power to rule the colony basically for a fee. They had to pay a tax to the King of England. The proprietors of Maryland were the Calverts, George and Cecilius Calvert. Calvert, or Lord Baltimore. They founded Maryland in 1634 for profit. They wanted to create a very lucrative plantation-based tobacco economy there. They also wanted to create a haven for English Catholics too. So even though they were the minority, again, about 20% of the population were Catholics in Maryland, they knew that they needed to put some laws into place to make sure that Catholicism was allowed to practice without persecution after their reign as well. So early on in their House of Government, they created something called the Toleration Act, or the Religious Toleration Act. And what that did, that was one of the early foundational pieces of religious freedom legislation. This protected all Christian religions to practice freely and take part in colonial government. Again, so that means Catholics, Protestants, Anglicans could all practice their religion and take part in colonial governments freely. And that was important because this was the formation of early religious rights here in America. So again, obviously there's going to be, later on in the Bill of Rights, our First Amendment freedom of religion is going to mimic these toleration acts early on. In Virginia, obviously, we're going to see tobacco being its main economy, same in Maryland, and we're going to see some eventual disadvantages of this, or some problems that arise of this. Obviously, as tobacco becomes more and more prevalent, you're going to see more and more land being put into cultivation into the western areas, meaning that you're going to see also more land being very closely tied to basically the, can't think of the word, wanting to take away from some of the Powhatan and the Native Americans' land. So, in turbulent Virginia, there was a continued western expansion into the backcountry, putting more land into cultivation. Typically, these were the indentured servants that were freed that are now going back to the backcountry and putting land in as basically just plantations or farms. Typically, these farms were not even owned. They just would plant plants and create a homestead. So one problem was that many of these backcountry farmers, or those former indentured servants, didn't even have voting rights because they didn't have land ownership. The second problem, there was going to be constant problems and skirmishes between land availability with the natives too. So two big problems are starting to arise because of this. And then in the east, you have William Berkeley, the governor of Virginia, who was a very autocratic ruler. And so there's already this tension between this leadership that really sort of looked down upon the western land and the people of the western areas, and these richer elites on the coastal areas. So we already see that America's really first social tension that was arising between colonists. You see the Tidewater, and those are the people of the East Coast that were the really wealthy people, the plantation owners, the landowners, the people that made decisions. And you had the Piedmont region, which was the western area. Those were the indentured servants, or the former indentured servants, the very small-scale landowners, or the people in the West who just didn't really have much money or land ownership at all. So you had this sort of social class battle that was going on, embedded into this colonization time period as well. So, and this will set up the first major rebellion in America. So that's called Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion sort of started for many different reasons. So Nathaniel Bacon was a backcountry gentry. He actually had some land and some nobility. So he had a place in the House of Burgesses. And what the backcountry was wanting, they were wanting protection from the natives who they believed were sort of harassing them in their land ownership. The Indians attacked white settlements, and the settlers struck back, and tensions flared. The reason why Berkeley dismissed Bacon and did not want to help out because he actually had very lucrative trade agreements with the natives. And so he didn't really want to mess that up. So he didn't really get involved at all. And the long-term, the long-term cause of this were these issues between rich and poor and representation that was going on, where the immediate causes were the conflicts with the natives. And eventually, Bacon and his men will sack Jamestown, they'll force Berkeley to exile, and eventually, suddenly, Bacon dies from dysentery, and the rebellion sort of kaputs. Some of the men will be hung, some of the men will be put on trial, and some of the men will just be forced back into the backcountry. In this rebellion, even though it failed, it will have some long-term significant effects. So one long-term significant effect is that it showed that settlers will constantly break treaties with the Native Americans to sort of this endless expansion westward. So that's sort of a trend that we see in American history. You also reveal tensions between the Tidewater and the Piedmont Ranges, these social class tensions that, again, America still has today, these between rich and poor, and then sort of like, even you can talk about minorities and non-minorities. So we have these ongoing representation issues due to land ownership and voting. And probably the most important is the importance of indentured servants will decrease because of this. And because of this, we're going to have a renewed importance on labor being taken from the slaves and black slaves being brought over to fill that void. The reason why we see this is that one, indentured servants eventually will gain their rights for land ownership, and they're going to want land. They're going to want to, be a part of society. The second thing that was going on is that during this time period of the late 1600s, we start seeing the Industrial Revolution start in England, which meant that more young men had job opportunities in the London factories and other factories around England. So that means less young men wanted to make that risk to come to America. So we see a labor decrease, or the lack of labor availability will force white settlers and white colonists and American colonists to then look other places for labor. And unfortunately, for our history, we look to slavery as a main stable labor source. And therefore, we see the slavery, again, very small in the early parts of colonization. Still, still a lot comparatively, but still very small. Then after Bacon's Rebellion in 1675, we see a huge increase of labor jumping up. And so that's a huge thing to note, a cause and effect relationship there. Okay, in our next section, we're going to be looking at Puritan New England. So the next wave of settlers will start coming over as Puritan settlers for religious freedom. The first settlement will be Plymouth in 1620. Then 10 years later, Massachusetts Bay Colony will come over in 1630. Again, for similar reasons, but also very distinct, different reasons as well. The Plymouth Colony were separatists. That means they wanted to completely separate from the Church of England, the Anglican Church. They first went to the Netherlands. They didn't find solace there, so they came back, raised some more money, got some more people on board, and then moved to America. They wanted to land closer to Jamestown in Virginia area. They were blown off course. They landed in Massachusetts. Before they got off the boat, William Bradford basically wrote the Mayflower Compact, a very short sort of document, sort of setting up a foundation for self-government, or what he says in there, a civil body politic, which basically means it's a representative form of government that God's going to control, but also the people of the colony will have representative ideas and say within this new colony as well. It's very important as sort of a foundation to what America will become as a democratic nation. And these pilgrims, along with the Massachusetts Bay Company, are going to come over in family units. That's really important because they're going to have a natural population increase because of the ability to have women and children rise up and then sort of take part in this population boom. Their intent was long-term settlement, so they brought with them, obviously draft animals and seeds and all the proper things to start a colony. Again, of course, they came over to America way late in the season, and they had a huge starving time as well because, again, they didn't have enough time to plant crops and make all their shelters in time before the really harsh northern winters. And so they almost did die out But they did get help from the Native American tribes there to sort of get them through those first couple years, and then they started to really thrive as a colony. There were very strong religious values that they brought with them, very strong family values, work values. That is important because those strong religious values are going to sort of pave the way for there to be education as a priority in those colonies. Because if you're going to be religious, you have to read the Bible. You pray, you got to read the Bible. And if you're going to read the Bible, you have to have literacy. So early on, mothers are going to be teaching their children, both boys and girls, literacy, which is going to allow this area of the America to be very educated comparatively to others. Another thing they did combine religion and state into sort of one thing. So religion and state and government were going to be one. So you really had to be Puritan to take part in any of the representative governments, and any of the sort of the town dealings had a church and religious overtone to them. And the town was really important. It was a very close-knit, sort of a very different than the southern colonies where the town was not as important. You had big plantations spread apart, where here you had people clustered together in a small town, and their fields were actually on the outskirts of the town, as you see. And in the town, you had the church, you had the school, and the town hall as major parts of the town development. That made a very close-knit community in a lot of these New England towns. Then, 10 years later, Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're going to come over in slightly different reasons. John Winthrop and his followers are going to want to basically not separate from the Church of England, but they were going to want to basically sort of just reform it or change it. So they were called non-separatist. Also, basically, John Winthrop created a sermon called The City Upon the Hill, where he wanted to make Boston, his community, basically a beacon, a light to shine and be mimicked and followed by other communities of Europe and the American colonies. He wanted to set up this very religious and democratic city that allows their people to trade and farm, and also where religion was going to be one of the core roots embedded into this colony. So again, religion was going to be extremely important here, where there was a state-adopted religion, and you had to be part of that if you wanted to sort of be part of this overall overarching community. And the Puritan faith was very strong. I mean, again, it was different than Catholicism in that any single person or laity could be basically ordinary members. So any of the church higher-ups were just members of the community, pretty much. And another big belief was predestination, where they believed that God had predestined either you going to heaven or you going to hell. And so that was a very strict interpretation of basically the ascendance to the higher land after death. Because of that, you're going to see some dissenters, some people that are going to basically be either forced out or want out. Again, three areas that are going to be, you're going to see Thomas Hooker, you're going to see Roger Williams, and you're going to see Anne Hutchins also be forced out, with Thomas Hooker and Roger Williams actually forming their own colonies, Rhode Island and Connecticut, and then Anne Hutchinson, another reason, what happened to her. So Roger Williams was a minister in the Puritan church, and he really thought that the church and the government should be separate. He thought that the government should be over here, and you're allowed to participate in the government without connections to the Puritan faith and church. He wanted that separation, which obviously contradicted Winthrop and his viewpoints. He also believed that the Puritans should not seize Native American land, but should buy it or trade for it. So basically, he was banished, and he basically went down and started up the Providence plantation, which eventually will form into Rhode Island. He bought the land from the Nagasaki Native Americans, and when he established his colony and his constitution, he actually puts in that there's going to be no legally established church. Basically, that you cannot have a state church that mandates the religion. So this is going to be the first colony, eventually state, that will basically have an openness for freedom of religion in its constitution. For Anne Hutchinson, a very different reason she was banished. She was a very higher up in the sort of as a woman in Boston. She was a midwife. She was an educated woman, And she started to sort of hold these weekly prayer meetings in her house, where many people would come, visit her. She even said that she doesn't need to go to church; that she can actually, basically, get direct communication from God herself and teach, the passages. And actually, that she actually criticized some of the Boston ministers in their teaching, which all were basically no-nos. Obviously, it was a very patriarchal society, meaning that ran by males, dominated by males. So they jailed her for this. And they jailed her and they put her and forced her on trial. And she would not repent. Eventually, she will make a written repentance. And at that point, the community will banish her and force her out. She'll move to Rhode Island. Eventually, she'll move to New York, and she'll actually be slaughtered and killed by Native Americans in New York. The Puritans and the Native Americans. The Native American population had been almost wiped out by plague several years earlier in New England, because early on in the 1400s, you saw some explorers sort of like explore that northern part of America. And they didn't actually take root and make colonies there, but they did come to shore to get resupplies. In that resupply, some disease had spread into the Native American populations. So they were very weakened already. Also, the Puritans had believed that they were God's chosen people, and God had chosen them to basically tame the land and cultivate the land. And by doing this, they believed that basically the Native Americans were not utilizing the land as God had chosen them to. So that gave them justification to then take land from natives and brutally sort of treat the natives sort of very differently from that. Also, something that I want to add here, I'm going to do that right now, is something that the Native Americans and the English did. So even though we don't see the massive conversion like the Spanish were doing to the Native Americans in the Spanish colonies, the English did try to convert Native Americans slightly. They were called praying towns. And what these were New England towns that were set up Okay, so these praying towns were New England towns that were set up by the English, by the Massachusettsians, to try to convert the Native Americans of that area into Christianity. Again, these were not forced; they were voluntary, and they basically were not very successful, as in very, very few conversions actually happened. But you do see that there was some attempt at conversion, but not a very violent or forced attempt like you do see with the Spanish. And you see we're going to see some of these tribes. Some of the bigger tribes that we're going to talk about here is the Nargassot Native Americans, the Nimpunk Native Americans, the Wampanoags, and several others are going to be sort of part of this war that's going to be happening in the 1600s and early 1700s. The first real war of the Native Americans in New England was called the Pequot War. It was a war between the Pequot tribe and the settlers. And the natives had allied with the settlers, and the Pequot had lost. And most of the survivors were killed or enslaved. So this was an early war where we see that early on, the settlers had basically aligned themselves with other Native Americans in hopes to basically beat the Pequot tribe down, and they did. That's one war that, again, that doesn't really come up on the AP test that often. One that does come up quite a bit is called King Philip's War, or Metacom's War. This was later on in the 1670s, 1670 to 1676. And Metacom, or King Philip, was a Wampanoag tribe, and he had alliances with the Nargassot and Nipmuc tribes of Rhode Island. And what had happened is that so much of their land had been either taken away or sold by them to the colonists that they were in a place where they couldn't really survive on the land that they had. So what they did, they basically agreed to sell all their land pretty much to the colonists, and in exchange buy guns and weapons of that land. Their thought was is that they were going to take those guns and weapons and then go to war against the colonists and win this war and then take their land back. And it was a pretty successful combination early on. The Indian tribes were able to basically sack all the outside communities, all the little towns and rural areas outside the more Boston urban area, you can call it urban at all, were very threatened. Eventually, though, as the war dragged on, the Mohawks had sort of been hired by the colonists to start raiding King Philip's and his tribe's settlements and their bases. And eventually they were put on the run for about a year and a half straight. So they couldn't plant any crops for their people to eat. So eventually at that point, they were starving. Eventually the Mohawks will kill Metacom, and at that point, pretty much the rebellion will die out. Even though there's going to be heavy loss on both sides, it does show that the natives will pretty much be put down, especially with one native tribe will cross another. Okay, our last segment, the British Empire in America. Again, the other parts of America we have not talked. So we're going to talk about the middle colonies, the southern colonies, and some British engagement about enforcement of laws and orders and stuff like that. So there's American colonies. We do need to know those: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Basically, Maine is part of Massachusetts at this point, and Vermont is basically part of New York at this point. They have not broken off into states at this point. Okay, we were talking about proprietary colonies. We'll go again on mercantilism. So, mercantilism, we talked about this in chapter 1, is a very important term when it comes to why England was in the colonies. They were wanting to make money through trade. They wanted to have the colonists be established and provide raw materials that to be sent back to England. Those raw materials like wool and stuff like that will be made into finished goods and then sold back to the colonies as finished goods at a very high price. And this is the whole concept there. So they want to have a very strong balance of trade. So they're going to put laws into place to make sure that this mercantilist policy stays strong. These laws are going to call the Navigational Acts. And what they state is two things. One, all goods must be on British or American vessels trade. So you cannot have French vessels or Dutch vessels or Spanish vessels trading directly with the colonies. If you want a Spanish or French good, those goods must go to England first and then be taxed and then brought back to the American colonies, or brought directly from the American colonies basically on British or American vessels. So all exports must pass through England. That's really important to note. Also, one more thing that's not there, I'm going to put it right now. The American colonies Okay, so another thing is that the American colonies cannot compete with British-made goods. And what that means is that America cannot make goods that Britain makes also. For example, wool. In America, they grow sheep. They obviously harvest wool. That wool could be made into linens or cloth or types of garments, so textiles. Well, America is not allowed to basically make that wool into textiles here in America, because that would compete directly with British-made textiles. They must send that wool back to England to be made in England into textiles to be then sent back to America. Same thing, so there's going to be different acts called, the Navigation Acts, part of that. One would be the Wool Act. or the Iron Act. And these acts basically forbid the American colonies from making wool into linens, or iron, or basically iron ore into finished iron, or making hats. Okay, the Carolinas. So North and South Carolina came into the colonies as one. Eventually they will split. And this was going to be set up as large plantational farms that are going to be nobility controlled. These plantation farms are going to be set up early on with the slave labor system as the main labor source. So again, they aren't going to have the high indentured servant like Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania will have, or New York, for example. They're going to have a high slave population early on. So they're going to get African slaves early on, and they're going to be farming mostly rice and, to some extent, indigo as well. And rice is a very labor-intensive source. Okay, New York is going to be set up by the Dutch in the 1630s. And they'll rule that New York for about 34 years before it's given to New England, or basically to England. In 1664, England will threaten the Dutch with war if they don't basically secede and hand over New York to English control. And since Dutch didn't really have much of a foothold in America anyway, the Dutch let New Amsterdam and New Netherlands go to England. At that point, England will grant this land to the Duke of York, and he'll rename it New York, as by the way. And they will basically continue to have a very strong importance on trade in this area. So New York is going to continue to be a very strong mercantilist area with a very strong trade, also a very diverse people as well in New York. Okay, Pennsylvania is going to be set up as a proprietary colony given to William Penn's father, and then William Penn's father will give it to him to rule over. And William Penn was a Quaker, which is a sort of form of Protestant, which is very different, and he wanted to set up the Pennsylvania as a refuge for the Quakers. Early on, Penn was going to do several things that's going to make his colony very unique. And we're going to go over those documents in class on Tuesday. But he's going to set up something called Penn's Frame of Government that's going to guarantee political liberties and religious freedoms and some rights for women as well. That's going to be very sort of land breaking. His colony is going to be more open and more free than any of the other colonies around. This will also lead to more occupation by other groups of people and more immigration by a diverse class. He's going to have religious freedom in his state or his colony, and it's going to grow very differently. Even though he doesn't ban slavery, pretty much slavery is put down early on in this colony as well as not going to be the norm. So there's going to be a very low slave footprint in Pennsylvania early on. He's also going to buy land from Native Americans rather than just steal it. And eventually, Pennsylvania is going to basically have Delaware, and Delaware is going to be basically broken apart from Pennsylvania. So Delaware is going to be part of Pennsylvania for a short time. Eventually, it'll break apart, and Delaware will be its own colony. And some Spanish colonies. We already sort of talked about these, but the Spanish colonies in North America were obviously in California, New Mexico, Texas, and Florida. The potential problem, especially right there, is that you have this really strong Spanish colony really close to the very lucrative plantations of South Carolina. And so that's going to give way to our last colony, Georgia. Georgia was founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe, and the biggest thing is that the real purpose of this was that we wanted an area. We wanted an area between the Carolinas and Florida to act as a buffer zone. So we will have to go to war to this. We actually have a small war that we attacked Spain. The war ended in 1748. And in this, the conclusion of the war, we get this area that's disputed between both areas called Georgia. Again, we primarily wanted this as a buffer zone. We wanted that sort of space between Spain and England to act as a zone so there'd be no conflict there. Okay, the evolution of British Empire in America. So, obviously, early on, a really thing to really note is that for the most part, England really gave America its freedom to sort of make its colonies the way they want to make them. They put very little oversight or very little control onto the colonies for the most part. There was some things they controlled, like trade. That was the one thing they sort of controlled. But even with trade, they've really sort of let the colonies act how they wanted to act for the most part. For one exception, the Dominion of New England. In 1686, we see a crackdown on the New England colonies, including New York. So you see Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and also New York. This is a very short period of time. So Dominion means domination. There's a crackdown of these colonies by the king and by the crown for a short period of time. This is going to be ordered by King James II. We're going to see Sir Edmund Andros appointed to oversee the New England. And in this, they're going to abolish legislative assemblies, the land grants. They're going to put massive control. And obviously, it's going to make the colonists really mad. Not really much happens. There's not a huge amount of revolt, not a huge amount of uprising, because this is short-lived. And eventually, it will end with the Glorious Revolution that happens in England. Obviously, the Glorious Revolution is a very important English thing that's going on. It sort of ousts King James. It puts in a Bill of Rights. It puts in like John Locke's philosophies on two trustees of government. This whole idea of life, liberty, and property become these natural rights John Locke's pushing for. And at that point, all's returned to normal in the colonies for the most part. And political assemblies and land was restored to the colonies, and all basically goes back as normal. So not really much tension-wise really happens there. We also have two wars that happened during this time period. None of these wars really come up on AP test. Just know that there were skirmishes in the New World prior to the French Indian War. The King William's War was between the English colonists and the Iroquois versus the French and Algonquins. And the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, was fighting in the Carolinas and Florida between America and, or the American colonies and England and the Spanish. Just know that there is century-long disputes between England and France and Spain. That's going to matter come the Revolution, though. And a couple acts I'm going to finish off the class with is the Molasses Act of 1733. England placed a high tariff or tax on imports of flesh molasses. This will matter when we look at Chapter 4. We're going to start talking about the Sugar Act. I'm going to re-enter this act right here. So that's why I bring this up. Just know that this is part of these navigation acts that really want to cut trade from the American colonies to other parts of the world. And also, another problem with the colonies is that the colonies needed to trade domestically, and all their hard currency, gold or silver, that's what hard currency is, or specie it's called, was being used to import goods from Europe. So they set up land banks, and they wanted to make their own currency. But England didn't want America to have its own currency because they couldn't trust those banks' currency. So England will put something called the Currency Act on the American colonies. And that's going to prevent all the New England colonies from establishing land banks and printing their own currency, which is going to be a problem because it's going to make it really hard to trade domestically. Because think about it, can you really trade or buy things without money? And that's what the problem was, is that they didn't have that currency available to them to trade from one person to another within their colonies. And that's going to be a resented thing also. Okay, that is the last thing. This is something I want you to just think about with this lecture going away. Between 1607 and 1754, did the colonies become more or less like England? And we'll start off Tuesday's class sort of talking about this question. Okay, there's a lecture. Hope you guys are all well. And yep, this is Chapter 2, American Colonies, and we're going to look at Chapter 3 come next lecture. Bye, all.